Part 1. Funeral. Front seats are for immediate family, my daughter-in-law whispered as she gently touched my elbow and guided me away from the first row at my husband's funeral. I remember staring at her manicured hand resting on the sleeve of my black wool coat and thinking how strange it felt to be treated like a guest at the burial of the man I had spent 43 years loving. The church smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax. Charles hated lilies. He once told me they reminded him of hotel lobbies trying too hard to feel expensive. But Vanessa had chosen them anyway. Everywhere I looked, there were white flowers, polished smiles, and people speaking in voices so soft they almost sounded rehearsed. I stood there quietly while guests filled the front pews. Business partners, country club friends, neighbors who barely knew Charles beyond his annual Christmas donations. My own son, Daniel, avoided my eyes as he helped Vanessa greet people near the casket. Every few minutes, she leaned into someone's shoulder with practiced grief, dabbing the corner of her perfectly untouched makeup. Eleanor's taking this very hard, I heard her tell one woman. We're doing everything we can for her. The woman glanced at me with the kind of pity people reserve for abandoned pets. I simply nodded and folded my gloves in my lap. The memorial program sitting beside me listed family members beneath Charles's photograph. Daniel Whitmore, Vanessa Whitmore, their children. My name appeared near the bottom under a smaller section labeled Special Thanks. I read it twice just to make sure my eyes hadn't betrayed me. 43 years of marriage reduced to special thanks. Outside, rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows while guests whispered about Charles's real estate empire, his private golf memberships, his charities, his lake house in Vermont. Nobody mentioned how he woke up every morning at 6 to make my coffee, because he claimed I never measured the grounds correctly. Nobody mentioned the way he always squeezed my hand twice before falling asleep. Those were the things that made a marriage, not the properties, not the money. Vanessa suddenly appeared beside me again, lowering herself carefully into the empty seat nearby. After the service, Martin Keller wants to discuss some paperwork, she said quietly. Nothing stressful, just practical matters. Practical matters. Charles had been dead for less than 48 hours, and already she sounded like a hotel manager preparing a room for the next guest. I nodded once. Across the aisle, I noticed two women from our neighborhood staring sympathetically in my direction. One of them leaned toward the other and whispered something before glancing at my modest black handbag. I knew that look. They thought I was another grieving widow about to discover unpaid bills and uncomfortable dependents. Vanessa probably thought the same thing. Maybe Daniel did too. They all assumed Charles had controlled everything while I simply arranged flowers and hosted dinner parties. The truth sat quietly inside my purse in a cream-colored envelope Martin had handed me the night before. I rested my hand over it gently as the organ music began to play. $28 million can feel surprisingly light when everyone around you thinks you have nothing. Part 2. Reception after funeral. The reception hall at Whitmore Country Club overlooked the river Charles loved to sail on every summer, although nobody bothered opening the curtains that afternoon. The room glowed with soft amber lighting from crystal chandeliers, while waiters carried silver trays filled with miniature crab cakes and champagne flutes through clusters of whispering guests. Charles would have hated every second of it. He used to joke that funerals should last 20 minutes at most because grief became dishonest the longer people stayed near free food. I sat alone at a small round table near the back wall while conversations drifted around me like cold smoke. Nobody intentionally ignored me. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, people offered the careful kindness reserved for someone they believed fragile. Temporary. A woman from the yacht club squeezed my shoulder and asked whether I would be moving closer to Daniel now. Another guest wondered aloud if maintaining the estate alone would become too overwhelming. Each question carried the same quiet assumption beneath it. Poor Eleanor. What will happen to her now? Vanessa moved elegantly through the room in a fitted black dress that probably cost more than my first car. She thanked guests for coming as though she were hosting a charity gala instead of attending her father-in-law's funeral. Every now and then she glanced toward me with a polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. Are you comfortable back there? She asked when she finally approached my table. Back there. As if I had naturally drifted into storage after Charles died. I am fine, I told her. She nodded quickly before turning to greet another group entering the room. Daniel followed close behind her, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. He looked exhausted already. His tie hung loose around his neck, and the dark circles beneath his eyes made him resemble Charles more than he had in years. For a moment, I almost reached for his hand. Then I heard Vanessa speaking softly beside him. "Do not forget to ask Martin about the transfer paperwork before he leaves." Daniel gave a distracted nod without looking in my direction. Transfer paperwork. Everything suddenly sounded so efficient now that Charles was gone. People laughed softly near the buffet table while a piano player performed old jazz standards in the corner. The entire afternoon felt choreographed. Even grief had become organized into schedules and logistics. I watched Vanessa lead Martin Keller toward a quieter section of the room near the fireplace. Martin had been Charles's attorney for nearly 30 years. He was one of the few people Charles genuinely trusted. Tall, silver-haired, always carrying himself with the calm confidence of a man who knew more than he ever revealed. When his eyes briefly met mine across the room, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not pity, something steadier. Respect, perhaps. Vanessa touched his arm while speaking animatedly. Martin listened politely but never smiled. After a few minutes, he excused himself and walked toward my table with measured steps. Vanessa's face tightened for half a second before her social smile returned. "Mrs. Whitmore," Martin said gently as he took the empty seat beside me. He always called me that in public even after decades of friendship with Charles. "I wanted to make sure you received the envelopes safely." I rested one hand over my handbag. "I did." "Good," he said quietly. Charles was very specific. Across the room, Daniel laughed weakly at something one of his colleagues said, while Vanessa rested her hand possessively against his chest. They looked comfortable already, settled into their new roles. I wondered whether grief always revealed people this quickly, or whether the signs had existed long before I noticed them. Martin lowered his voice further. "There will be a formal reading in 3 days. Until then, I strongly advise you not to discuss finances with anyone." I almost smiled at that. Finances. If only he knew how many conversations I had already overheard that afternoon. People estimating property taxes, wondering whether Daniel planned to sell the Vermont house, speculating about investments they assumed Charles alone had controlled. Nobody imagined I had spent the last 15 years quietly managing half the portfolio myself. Charles used to hand me quarterly reports across our kitchen counter while eating toast in his bathrobe. "You are better at seeing people clearly than I am," he once told me. "That makes you better with money too." At the time, I thought he was complimenting my caution. Sitting there in that crowded reception hall, listening to strangers discuss my future as though I were not sitting 10 feet away, I finally understood what he had really meant. Part 3 Night at Estate. The rain had stopped by the time I returned home that evening, but the air still carried the damp heaviness of early October. Whitmore Estate sat quietly at the end of the long circular driveway, its stone exterior glowing pale beneath the porch lights. For the first time in more than 40 years, I walked through the front door without hearing Charles call out from his study. The silence felt unnatural, heavy. I placed my handbag carefully on the entry table beneath the oil painting we bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Charleston. Vanessa used to joke that the painting looked depressing because of the storm clouds in the background. Charles always answered the same way. "That is because you only notice the clouds." I stood there for several seconds staring at it while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the trees. The house smelled faintly of cedarwood and old books. Familiar things suddenly felt fragile after a funeral. I removed my gloves slowly and noticed someone had already moved the framed family photographs from the hallway console. In their place sat a tall arrangement of white lilies tied with a black ribbon. Vanessa again. She had probably sent someone ahead while I was still at the reception. Even grief inside my own home was beginning to feel curated by her. Upstairs, Charles's closet remained half open exactly as he left it 3 mornings earlier. His navy cashmere coat still hung nearest the door beside the wool scarf he wore every winter, whether it was cold enough or not. I rested my fingers against the sleeve for only a moment before closing the door gently. Some pains become unbearable if you stare directly at them for too long. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop downstairs just as I began making tea. Daniel's name appeared across the screen. I answered immediately. "Mom," he said, sounding distracted. "Did you get home all right?" I did. A brief silence followed. In the background, I could hear Vanessa speaking to someone. Dishes clinked softly. They were already home too. Vanessa and I were thinking maybe we should come by tomorrow, he continued carefully. There are probably a lot of things around the house you should not handle alone right now. I poured hot water into my teacup and watched steam rise slowly into the kitchen light. Such as, another pause, bills, documents, Dad's office, stuff like that. Stuff like that. Charles spent decades building companies, trusts, investments, partnerships, and properties worth more than most people could imagine, and my son had reduced it all to stuff like that less than 12 hours after the burial. That is thoughtful, I replied evenly. But I am managing. Before Daniel could answer, Vanessa's voice drifted clearly. Through the phone. She was not whispering quite quietly enough. Ask her if she found the account passwords yet. I looked out the kitchen window toward the dark outline of the gardens Charles planted himself 20 years ago. Hydrangeas lined the stone pathway leading toward the greenhouse he insisted on building after retirement, even though he barely knew how to grow tomatoes. Suddenly, I remembered one winter evening when we sat at this exact kitchen table reviewing quarterly reports together while snow covered the backyard. I had pointed toward one particular investment manager and told Charles the man seemed dishonest. How can you tell? He asked. Because he talks too much when simple answers would do, I said. Charles laughed for nearly a minute. 2 weeks later, the manager was arrested for fraud. Mom, Daniel's voice pulled me back. Are you there? I am here. We are just trying to help. Help. That word sounded different now. Softer on the surface. Sharper underneath. I stirred my tea slowly without drinking it. You should both get some rest tonight, I told him. It has been a long day. He exhaled quietly, relieved perhaps that I was not resisting. All right. We will stop by tomorrow afternoon. After the call ended, the kitchen became silent again except for the ticking grandfather clock near the dining room entrance. Charles used to wind it every Sunday evening without fail. I carried my tea into his study and sat behind the large mahogany desk where he signed contracts worth millions over the years. A single cream-colored envelope rested inside the center drawer exactly where I had hidden it before the funeral. I opened it carefully and unfolded the documents Martin had given me. Across the top page, beneath Charles's unmistakable signature, one sentence stood out more clearly than anything else. In the event that my wife is pressured, displaced, manipulated, or publicly humiliated regarding matters of inheritance, all discretionary distributions to Daniel Whitmore and Vanessa Whitmore shall be permanently revoked. I read the line twice. Then I folded the papers neatly and returned them to the envelope. Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows while somewhere upstairs an old floorboard settled with a quiet creak. Charles knew them better than I realized. Part 4 next afternoon. The next afternoon arrived gray and cold, the kind of weather Charles used to call boardroom weather, because it made everyone serious before they even spoke. By noon, the estate already felt different. Too quiet in some places. Too watched in others. I stood in the breakfast room polishing the silver coffee spoon Charles brought home from London 20 years earlier when I noticed a black SUV slowly turning into the driveway. Vanessa always arrived early when she wanted control of a situation. Through the tall kitchen windows, I watched her step out wearing a camel-colored wool coat and dark sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. Daniel followed behind her carrying 2 cardboard coffee trays from a cafe downtown. Neither of them looked like people visiting a grieving widow. They looked organized, prepared. Vanessa entered first without knocking, offering me the kind of gentle smile people practice in mirrors. We brought coffee, she announced brightly as though she were arriving for brunch instead of inventorying a dead man's life. Daniel kissed my cheek quickly before setting the trays on the counter. How are you holding up today? He asked. Holding up. Another phrase people use when they are waiting for someone to collapse. I slept well, I answered. Vanessa glanced around the kitchen slowly. Her eyes lingered on the copper pans hanging above the stove and the fresh flowers beside the sink. You have always kept this house beautiful, she said. Compliments from Vanessa always felt strangely hollow, as though she were reading lines from a magazine article about kindness. Daniel opened one of the coffee cups and handed it toward me. We thought maybe we could help organize Dad's office today. There are probably important files everywhere. I noticed how naturally they both said Dad now instead of Charles. Ownership changes language quickly. I wrapped my hands around the warm coffee cup without drinking from it. There is no rush, I said calmly. Vanessa removed her sunglasses and placed them carefully on the marble island. Of course not, she replied. We just want to make things easier for you moving forward. Moving forward. That phrase again. As if grief were a moving company requiring paperwork and efficient scheduling. Daniel wandered toward the hallway leading to Charles's study, while Vanessa remained near me in the kitchen. You know, she said softly, lowering her voice. Daniel has been worried about you staying here alone. I stirred my untouched coffee slowly. This house has been my home for 43 years. Exactly, she answered quickly. That is why we think a smaller place might actually feel refreshing eventually. Less maintenance. Less stress. There it was. Not direct enough to sound cruel. Not soft enough to sound loving. Vanessa specialized in sentences balanced carefully between concern and calculation. Upstairs, I heard the faint sound of a drawer opening inside Charles's office. Daniel was already searching through things. Vanessa leaned closer against the kitchen island. The market is still excellent right now, she continued. If the estate needs liquidity later, selling sooner rather than later could really protect everyone. Protect everyone. I almost admired how elegantly she wrapped greed inside practical language. Charles once told me that truly dangerous people rarely sound emotional. They sound reasonable. I see, I replied. Vanessa smiled, encouraged perhaps by my calmness. And there are some wonderful retirement communities near the coast now. Luxury ones. They have private dining rooms, yoga studios, ocean views. I looked directly at her for the first time that afternoon. I am not moving into a retirement community. Her smile froze briefly before returning. No one is pressuring you, Eleanor. We are only discussing possibilities. Upstairs, another drawer slid open. Then another. Daniel was moving faster now. I wondered whether he realized how loud desperation sounded inside a quiet house. Vanessa picked up her coffee cup again and crossed one elegant leg over the other. Honestly, she added gently, this house is probably too large for one person anyway. I glanced toward the hallway where family photographs still lined the walls despite Vanessa replacing several downstairs already. Daniel at 12 holding his first fishing rod beside Charles at Lake Champlain. Christmas mornings near the fireplace. Summer cookouts beneath the maple trees. Every corner of this house contained pieces of my life long before Vanessa entered it wearing expensive perfume and rehearsed smiles. Charles built this house for me, I said quietly. Vanessa tilted her head sympathetically. And I am sure he would want you comfortable now. Comfortable. Such a small word for someone already measuring curtains before the widow finished mourning. A few moments later, Daniel reappeared holding several folders against his chest. His face looked strangely flushed. Mom, he said carefully, where are the investment account records Dad kept? Vanessa turned toward him too quickly. Daniel, she warned softly, though not because she disapproved. Only because she wanted patience. I watched both of them standing there inside my kitchen surrounded by 40 years of memories they already viewed as future assets. Then I remembered the final sentence in Charles's handwritten note attached to the trust documents. If they begin showing you who they are too quickly, let them. Part 5 Martin arrives. Daniel set the folders carefully on the dining room table as though carrying something fragile, but I noticed the impatience in the way his fingers tapped against the leather covers. Vanessa remained near the kitchen doorway watching both of us with that same polished expression she wore at charity auctions and neighborhood dinners. Calm on the surface, calculating underneath. Afternoon light stretched across the hardwood floors in long pale rectangles while the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Charles once said old clocks make people honest because silence feels heavier between each sound. Dad always kept duplicate account records somewhere, Daniel said, loosening his tie slightly. I just figured now would be a good time to organize everything. Organize. Another harmless word carrying sharp edges underneath. I folded my hands neatly in front of me. Your father handled records very carefully. Vanessa stepped forward before Daniel could answer. Exactly why we should start reviewing things sooner rather than later, she said smoothly. There could be tax deadlines, transfer requirements, legal obligations. She spoke about my husband's life the same way hotel managers discuss renovations. Efficiently, emotionlessly. I walked slowly toward the dining room and pulled out one of the chairs near the window. Outside, wind moved through the maple trees lining the driveway, scattering orange leaves across the stone path. Charles swept himself every autumn, no matter how many landscapers we employed. Sit down, I told them calmly. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Daniel before both took seats across from me. They looked almost relieved by my cooperation. That was the thing about entitled people. Silence always sounds like surrender to them. Daniel opened one folder and slid several papers onto the table. Property assessments, insurance summaries, estate maintenance estimates. Vanessa leaned forward slightly as he spoke. The annual upkeep here is enormous, Mom. Staff salaries alone are almost $200,000 a year. Her eyes drifted briefly around the room while she spoke. Crystal chandelier, imported wallpaper, hand-carved molding Charles spent months selecting during renovations 15 years ago. She was not looking at a home anymore. She was evaluating inventory. There are ways to simplify things, Vanessa continued carefully. You could keep the Vermont property and sell this estate. Or maybe the opposite. Honestly, maintaining multiple residences alone at your age seems exhausting. At your age? Such a small phrase. So casually cruel. I reached for my teacup without responding immediately. Across from me, Daniel avoided direct eye contact while flipping through another folder. Vanessa found a beautiful community in Connecticut, he added quietly. Private cottages, full medical staff, security. It actually looks really nice. I almost smiled then. Not because anything felt amusing, but because Charles predicted this conversation almost perfectly. 2 years earlier, after a dinner where Vanessa spent an hour discussing luxury retirement developments. With unusual enthusiasm, Charles leaned against the kitchen counter and said, "One day she will try to package control as concern." At the time, I accused him of being unfair. Sitting there now, listening to my future reduced to brochures and convenience, I realized he had not been cynical enough. Vanessa crossed her legs elegantly and softened her voice further. We are only thinking about what is best for you emotionally and financially. Financially, that word finally settled heavily between us. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Dad handled most of the investments personally, and honestly, Mom, I just do not want you overwhelmed. I looked directly at my son then. Really looked at him. The little boy who used to fall asleep against Charles's shoulder during long car rides now sat across from me, discussing my displacement before his father had even been buried a full week. Grief changes people, but greed reveals them faster. Your father trusted me with far more than you realize, I said quietly. Vanessa smiled patiently, the way people smile at elderly relatives who insist on driving after dark. Of course he did. Her tone carried just enough softness to make the dismissal feel polite. Then the doorbell rang. Sharp. Precise. Daniel glanced toward the hallway. Vanessa straightened immediately. I already knew who it was before the housekeeper opened the front door. Martin Keller entered carrying a dark leather briefcase beneath one arm, his charcoal overcoat still dusted with cold rain. The entire atmosphere inside the room shifted the moment he stepped across the threshold. Vanessa rose quickly to greet him. Martin, she said warmly, almost too warmly. Perfect timing. We were just discussing practical next steps for Eleanor. Martin removed his gloves slowly before answering. I imagine you were. His eyes moved briefly toward the folders spread across the dining table, then toward me, calm, knowing. Mrs. Whitmore, he said evenly. Charles instructed me to deliver additional documents personally today. The room became very quiet after that. Even the grandfather clock seemed louder. Part 6 Trust Clarification. Martin placed the leather briefcase carefully on the dining room table beside the folders Daniel had spread out earlier. The sound of the metal clasps unlocking echoed softly through the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Outside, cold rain tapped steadily against the tall windows while the chandelier above us reflected pale afternoon light across the polished wood surface. Vanessa remained standing beside Daniel's chair, her posture elegant but tense now. I could always tell when she felt uncertain because she stopped smiling with her hands. Usually, she gestured constantly during conversations, touching glasses, adjusting bracelets, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her sleeves. Now her arms stayed perfectly still at her sides. Martin removed a thick cream-colored envelope from the briefcase and placed it directly in front of me. My name appeared across the front in Charles's handwriting. Even after all these years, I could recognize his penmanship instantly. Sharp lines, controlled strokes. The handwriting of a man who trusted few people completely. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What exactly is that? He asked. Martin adjusted his glasses before answering. Additional estate instructions your father requested remain private until the formal reading. Vanessa recovered first. Of course, she said smoothly, though disappointment flickered briefly across her face. We were only trying to help Eleanor understand everything. Martin's expression did not change. I am certain you were. His voice carried the kind of politeness that feels colder than open criticism. I slid one finger beneath the envelope flap slowly, but did not open it yet. Somehow I already knew whatever waited inside would confirm everything Charles feared before he died. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck uneasily. Martin, maybe you can answer something for us. Dad had so many moving parts financially. We are just worried Mom could become overwhelmed managing all of it herself. Martin folded his gloves carefully before placing them beside the briefcase. Your mother has been involved in your father's financial decisions for over 15 years. Silence settled heavily over the table after that. Daniel blinked. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. I did not realize Eleanor handled the investments personally, she said. There it was again. Eleanor. Not Mom. Not Mrs. Whitmore. Just Eleanor. Familiar enough to sound warm. Distant enough to avoid respect. Martin looked directly at her. Mrs. Whitmore personally approved several of Whitmore Capital's highest-performing acquisitions over the last decade. Vanessa's face remained composed, but I noticed the faint tightening near the corners of her mouth. Daniel stared toward me with visible confusion. Dad never mentioned that. Your father valued privacy, Martin replied evenly. I finally opened the envelope then. Inside rested several documents clipped together alongside a folded handwritten letter. Charles always wrote personal letters on heavy ivory stationery because he claimed cheap paper encouraged careless thoughts. I unfolded the letter carefully while the others watched in silence. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. That was how it began. No greeting. No dramatic sentiment. Just certainty. I continued reading quietly while rain moved across the windows in soft waves. You spent most of our marriage protecting people from consequences they earned themselves. I spent most of mine pretending our son would eventually become stronger than his weaknesses. We were both wrong sometimes. My chest tightened slightly at that line. Across the table, Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair as though sensing something had changed without understanding what. Vanessa remained perfectly still now, watching me, measuring every reaction. Charles's handwriting continued across the page with the same calm precision he carried into every boardroom meeting for 40 years. I built safeguards because money reveals character faster than hardship ever does. If Daniel and Vanessa are treating you with respect, fairness, and patience, then none of this will matter. If they are not, then promise me you will finally stop protecting people simply because they share your last name. I lowered the letter slowly. Nobody spoke. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway beyond the dining room, while somewhere upstairs an old pipe groaned softly inside the walls. Martin cleared his throat after several seconds. There are legal mechanisms already activated regarding discretionary trust distributions, he explained carefully. Vanessa's eyes sharpened immediately at the word distributions. Daniel looked between us helplessly. Activated, he repeated. Martin nodded once. Charles created behavioral clauses tied directly to inheritance access. Vanessa finally sat down beside Daniel, though her posture remained rigid now. Behavioral clauses? She asked lightly. Too lightly. Martin folded his hands together. Your father anticipated certain possibilities. I looked back down at Charles's letter resting quietly against the table. For the first time since the funeral, grief began mixing with something colder. Not anger. Clarity. Charles had not simply left me money. He had left me protection. Part 7 Emotional Tension Escalation. Vanessa recovered faster than Daniel did. She always had. Some people panic when control slips away from them. Vanessa reorganized herself instead. I watched it happen in real time across the dining room table. Her shoulders relaxed first. Then her smile returned, softer now, carefully measured. By the time Martin closed his briefcase again, she looked composed enough to host another charity fundraiser. Well, she said lightly, folding her hands together. Charles certainly believed in planning ahead. Martin gave a polite nod without responding. Daniel still looked unsettled. His eyes moved between me and the documents resting near my elbow, as though trying to solve a puzzle he had only just realized existed. Mom, he said slowly, why did Dad never tell me any of this? The sadness in his voice almost reached me. Almost. But grief had a strange way of sharpening memory. I remembered every ignored phone call after Charles's surgery. Every holiday dinner Vanessa shortened because they had better plans. Every conversation where my son slowly stopped sounding like family and started sounding like a guest. Your father valued observation, I answered quietly. He preferred listening before speaking. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing one hand against his jaw. Vanessa reached over and touched his arm gently before looking toward me again. No one is trying to upset you, Eleanor, she said. We are all grieving. Grieving. The words sounded clean coming from her. Elegant. Almost convincing. But there was something colder beneath it now. Caution. For the first time since the funeral, Vanessa no longer looked at me like a helpless widow. She looked at me like a variable she had miscalculated. Martin stood slowly from the table and adjusted his coat sleeves. The official reading remains scheduled for Friday morning, he said evenly. Until then, I recommend everyone avoid premature financial decisions. Vanessa smiled immediately. Of course. Yet her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her coffee cup. Tiny movements always reveal more truth than words. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. So nobody can access anything yet? Martin looked directly at him. Certain structures are already active. Others will be finalized Friday. Daniel nodded slowly, though confusion still lingered across his face. Vanessa remained silent this time, thinking, recalculating. The rain outside had finally stopped, leaving the windows streaked silver beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere deeper inside the house, the heating system hummed softly through the vents. The estate suddenly felt enormous again. Not lonely exactly, just observant. As though every hallway carried echoes of conversations Charles had anticipated long before any of us arrived at this moment. Martin gathered his briefcase near the front entrance while I walked him toward the door. Behind us, Daniel quietly stacked the folders back together while Vanessa spoke to him in a voice too low for individual words. Martin paused before stepping outside. Charles trusted your instincts more than anyone's, he said quietly. Do not second-guess them now. I nodded once. I will not. He hesitated briefly before adding. And Eleanor, the behavioral clauses are stricter than they realize. Then he left. Cold evening air drifted briefly through the doorway before it closed again. When I returned to the dining room, Vanessa was standing near the fireplace studying the framed family photographs arranged across the mantel. One picture showed Charles teaching our granddaughter Lily how to fish during a summer trip to Vermont. Another showed Daniel at 16 beside his father outside the first office building Charles ever purchased. Vanessa picked up the silver-framed photograph from our 40th anniversary party and smiled faintly. Charles always did admire loyalty, she said without looking at me. The sentence sounded harmless, but underneath it sat another meaning entirely. She knew now, not everything, but enough to understand the inheritance was no longer guaranteed. He admired character, I corrected softly. Vanessa finally turned toward me then. For a brief second, neither of us smiled. Daniel entered the room, carrying his coat over one arm. We should probably head home, he said quietly. Vanessa placed the photograph back carefully before slipping into her coat. Get some rest tonight, Eleanor, she said gently near the doorway. Friday will probably be emotional for everyone. Emotional. Such an interesting choice of word from someone already preparing for battle. Part 8 Official Reading. Friday morning arrived bright and cold, with thin sunlight stretching across the marble floors of Keller and Associates on Madison Avenue. The law office occupied the top floor of an old limestone building Charles respected because it still valued privacy over spectacle. I arrived 10 minutes early wearing the navy wool coat Charles bought me during our final trip to Boston. The receptionist offered coffee softly, almost carefully, as though everyone inside the building already understood this meeting mattered for reasons beyond grief. Martin greeted me personally near the hallway leading toward the conference rooms. You look rested, he observed quietly. I slept, I answered. He gave a faint nod, the closest thing Martin Keller ever showed to approval. Through the glass walls farther down the corridor, I could already see Vanessa seated beside Daniel inside the conference room. She wore ivory instead of black today. Not funeral grief anymore. Business grief. Her leather portfolio rested open beside her, papers already organized into neat sections. Daniel looked pale beneath the fluorescent lighting, his shoulders tense inside an expensive charcoal suit Charles would have called trying too hard. Vanessa noticed me first. Her smile appeared immediately. Controlled. Elegant. "Eleanor," she said warmly as I entered. "We saved you the chair near the window." Near the window. Not at the head of the table where Charles always sat during meetings. Interesting. I thanked her anyway and took the seat calmly. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee, polished wood, and printer paper. Outside, Manhattan traffic moved silently beneath the tall windows 20 stories below us. Martin entered moments later carrying several thick folders beneath one arm. 2 additional attorneys followed quietly behind him and sat near the far end of the table without introducing themselves. Vanessa's eyes narrowed almost invisibly at that. More witnesses than expected. Martin placed the folders carefully across the table before speaking. Charles Whitmore updated his estate structure approximately 14 months ago. He began evenly. Vanessa reached for Daniel's hand beneath the table. The estate includes multiple trusts, business holdings, investment accounts, charitable foundations, and real property assets distributed across 7 states. Daniel swallowed hard. Vanessa remained perfectly still now. Martin continued calmly. As outlined in the revised directives, Eleanor Whitmore assumes full controlling authority over Whitmore Capital Holdings effective immediately. Silence. Complete silence. Even the heating system seemed quieter suddenly. Daniel blinked twice. Vanessa's expression did not change immediately, but I noticed her fingers slowly release Daniel's hand beneath the table. Full controlling authority? Daniel repeated carefully. Martin nodded once. Including discretionary control over all family trust distributions. Vanessa leaned forward slightly then, her voice smooth but tighter now. I thought Charles intended the family trusts to transition jointly after Eleanor's passing. Martin opened one folder and adjusted his glasses. That was the original structure prior to revision. Prior to revision. Such small words for such devastating consequences. Daniel looked toward me finally. Truly looked at me for the first time in years. Not as his aging mother. Not as someone dependent. As someone holding power. "Why would Dad change everything?" he asked quietly. Martin slid a single document across the polished table surface. Because he added behavioral contingencies. Vanessa's face lost color almost instantly. She read faster than Daniel did. Her eyes moved sharply line by line before stopping halfway down the page. "This cannot be serious," she said softly. Martin's expression remained neutral. "It is legally binding." Daniel picked up the document next. I watched confusion slowly turn into disbelief across his face. The clause appeared exactly as Charles described it in his letter. Any demonstrated effort to pressure, manipulate, displace, diminish, or publicly humiliate Eleanor Whitmore regarding financial dependency, housing arrangements, inheritance expectations, or personal autonomy shall result in permanent forfeiture of all discretionary trust access for the offending parties. Vanessa set the paper down very carefully. Too carefully. "That language is subjective," she said evenly. "Not according to the documented witness statements already provided," Martin replied. The room became still again. Daniel stared toward him. "Witness statements." Martin folded his hands calmly atop the table. "Your father anticipated potential concerns long before his passing. Several interactions after the funeral have already been independently documented." Vanessa stopped blinking for a moment. Just long enough for the mask to crack. Part 9 Final Power Shift. The silence inside the conference room lasted so long that I could hear the faint clicking of traffic signals far below the windows on Madison Avenue. Vanessa sat perfectly still beside Daniel, one hand resting against the edge of the polished table while the other remained frozen near the document Martin had slid toward her. For the first time since Charles died, she looked unprepared. Not emotional. Vanessa rarely allowed herself that luxury, but uncertain, and uncertainty looked unnatural on her. Daniel read the clause again, more slowly this time, his eyes moving carefully across every word as though hoping the meaning might change if he reached the end differently. It did not. Martin remained calm at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly while the 2 associate attorneys beside him quietly reviewed their notes. No one rushed to fill the silence. Charles always believed silence exposed character faster than arguments ever could. "Dad actually documented conversations?" Daniel asked finally, his voice low and strained. Martin nodded once. Your father retained records regarding concerns tied to estate pressure and family coercion. Vanessa straightened slightly in her chair. Coercion is a very dramatic interpretation, she said evenly. We were trying to help Eleanor manage an overwhelming situation. Martin's expression did not change. Encouraging Mrs. Whitmore to leave her home less than 72 hours after the funeral was specifically addressed within the trust protections. Vanessa's jaw tightened almost invisibly. That was concern, not pressure. Intent is less relevant than conduct, Martin replied calmly. I watched Daniel lower the papers slowly back onto the table. His face looked older suddenly, tired in a way grief alone could not explain. Mom, he said quietly, turning toward me at last. Why did you not say anything? Such a simple question. I looked at my son for several seconds before answering. Because I wanted to see who you became when you thought I had nothing. The words landed softly inside the room, but their effect was immediate. Vanessa looked away first, toward the windows, toward the city, anywhere except me. Daniel stared down at his hands. For years, I had mistaken avoidance for weakness and politeness for love. Charles had not made that mistake. Martin opened another folder carefully. As of this morning, Eleanor Whitmore retains sole authority over all discretionary family distributions totaling approximately $28 million in liquid and investment-controlled assets. There it was, the number none of them expected. $28 million. Not hidden offshore accounts. Not mysterious. Inheritance rumors. Simply the truth sitting quietly in legal documents while everyone spent a week treating me like a dependent guest in my own life. Daniel exhaled sharply under his breath. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly before recovering again. Always recovering. Surely there is room for discussion here, she said finally, returning her attention toward Martin. Families say unfortunate things during grief. Martin adjusted one page inside the folder. The behavioral clauses are irrevocable. Irrevocable, Vanessa repeated softly. The words sounded heavier when someone else controlled the future. Daniel looked toward me again, and for a moment I saw something honest cross his face. Regret, perhaps, or shame, maybe both. Mom, he began carefully, I never wanted you to think we were trying to push you aside. I thought about the funeral seating arrangement, the retirement brochures, the conversations held around me instead of with me, the assumption that age automatically meant helplessness. Then I remembered Charles standing beside the kitchen window one winter evening years ago, watching snow fall across the backyard while he quietly said, "One day they will underestimate you because you are kind. Do not confuse that with weakness when it happens." I folded my gloves slowly and placed them into my handbag. Your father spent 43 years teaching me the difference between love and convenience, I said quietly. I finally listened. Nobody answered after that. Martin closed the final folder and slid several signed documents toward me for review. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected brightly against the glass towers across the avenue, while Manhattan carried on as though lives had not just shifted permanently 20 stories above the street. I signed each page carefully using the fountain pen Charles gave me on our 30th anniversary. Vanessa remained silent now. No polished speeches. No careful concern. Just stillness. Daniel looked exhausted. Older somehow. Grief reveals people slowly. Money reveals them immediately. When the meeting finally ended, Martin stood and opened the conference room door for me personally. I gathered my coat and handbag before walking toward the hallway without rushing. Behind me, no one spoke. No one tried to stop me. And for the first time that entire week, nobody looked at me with pity.